The fluorescent lights hummed quietly above David as he pushed his cleaning cart down the empty hallway of Riverside Community Center. It was past 9 in the evening, and the building had that peaceful silence that only comes when everyone else has gone home. His footsteps echoed softly against the polished floors as he made his way toward the main auditorium. The last stop on his nightly cleaning route. David had been working this job for 3 years now, ever since everything in his life had turned upside down. The night shift suited him perfectly because it meant he could be home every afternoon when his 2 little girls got off the school bus. 8-year-old Lucy and 6-year-old Amy needed their dad there, especially since it was just the 3 of them now. He paused outside the auditorium doors and took a deep breath. This room always brought back memories, both beautiful and painful. The stage where he now mopped floors every night was the same type of stage where he used to perform, back when music was his whole world. Back when life was different, before everything changed. David had been a music teacher at the local elementary school. He loved watching kids discover music for the first time, seeing their faces light up when they finally played a song correctly. But more than teaching, David had always dreamed of performing professionally. He'd spent countless evenings practicing piano, writing his own songs, and playing at small venues around town. His wife Rebecca had always been his biggest supporter. She would sit in the front row at every performance, no matter how small the audience. "You're going to be famous someday," she would tell him with that bright smile of hers. "And I'll be right there cheering you on." But cancer had other plans. 2 years ago, Rebecca lost her battle with the disease, leaving David to raise their daughters alone. The medical bills had piled up quickly, and his teacher's salary wasn't enough to cover everything. That's when he made the difficult decision to leave teaching and take the janitorial job at the community center. The pay was better, and the night hours meant he could take care of Lucy and Amy during the day. David pushed open the auditorium doors and wheeled his cart inside. The room was large enough to hold about 300 people, with rows of blue fabric seats facing a modest stage. Tonight, the space felt especially quiet. Earlier that evening, there had been a talent show rehearsal, but it had ended early when the sound system started acting up as he began sweeping between the rows of seats. David found the usual collection of forgotten items: a child's hair clip, a crumpled program, someone's reading glasses. He collected them carefully and placed them in the lost and found box. These little moments reminded him that this building was full of life during the day. Even if it felt empty now, he worked methodically, the way he'd learned to do everything since becoming a single father. There was comfort and routine in knowing exactly what needed to be done and when. First the seats, then the aisles, then the stage itself. The stage was always last because it took the most time, and honestly, because it was the hardest part of his job. Every night when he climbed those 3 steps onto the wooden platform, David felt the weight of his abandoned dreams. The old upright piano sat there like a patient friend, its dark wood surface reflecting the stage lights that were left on for cleaning. He'd been a pianist long before he became a teacher, long before he became a father, long before he became a widower working the night shift to make ends meet. As David began mopping the stage floor, he couldn't help but glance at the piano. The bench was pushed in neatly and the key cover was closed. During the day, this instrument brought joy to so many people. Children took lessons here, community theater groups used it for rehearsals, and local musicians performed concerts for their neighbors. But late at night, the piano seemed almost lonely. David knew that feeling well. He finished mopping around the piano and started to pack up his cleaning supplies. This was usually when he would head to the next building, but tonight, something made him pause. Maybe it was because the talent show rehearsal had ended so abruptly. Maybe it was because he'd had a particularly long day with the girls, helping Lucy with her math homework while trying to convince Amy to eat her vegetables, or maybe it was because earlier that day, Amy had asked him why there wasn't a piano in their house anymore. They'd had to sell his beloved baby grand piano to help pay the medical bills, and Amy was too young to really understand why. "Did you forget how to play, Daddy?" she had asked innocently. David looked around the empty auditorium one more time. The building was quiet, and he was alone. His supervisor wouldn't be back until morning, and the security guard was making rounds in another building. What would it hurt to just sit at the piano for a minute? He walked over to the old upright and lifted the key cover. The black and white keys looked back at him like old friends he hadn't spoken to in too long. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out the bench and sat down. The height was perfect, just like it had always been. David placed his fingers on the keys but didn't press down. He could feel the smooth coolness of the ivory against his fingertips. How long had it been since he'd really played? Not just the quick scales he sometimes showed the girls, but really played with his whole heart? What David didn't know was that the community center's new security system included cameras with audio recording. What he also didn't know was that when the sound technician had left earlier after the rehearsal problems, he'd forgotten to turn off the main audio system. The microphones on stage were still live, and any sound would be broadcast through the speakers in the lobby and main hallways. As his fingers found their first tentative notes, David felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years. It wasn't quite happiness. He wasn't ready for that yet, but it was something close to peace. The simple melody he played was one Rebecca had always loved, a gentle piece that had been one of the first songs he'd learned as a child. The music seemed to fill not just the auditorium, but some empty space inside his chest that he'd been carrying around without even realizing it. For just a moment, David wasn't thinking about unpaid bills, or parent-teacher conferences, or whether he was doing enough for his daughters. He was just a man playing piano, letting the music say all the things he couldn't find words for. He had no idea that his quiet moment of comfort was about to change everything. David's fingers moved across the keys like they were remembering an old conversation. The simple melody he'd started with began to grow into something more complex, something that came from deep inside his chest. He didn't plan what to play next. The music just seemed to flow out of him like water that had been held back by a dam for too long. The first piece he played was one Rebecca had hummed while cooking dinner. She wasn't a musician herself, but she had this way of hearing melodies. Everywhere, in the sound of rain on the roof, in the rhythm of the washing machine, in the way their daughters laughed together. This particular tune had become their song, the one he would play softly in the evening while she folded laundry or helped the girls with their homework. As the last notes of that gentle melody faded into the empty auditorium, David felt his heart racing. It had been so long since he'd played anything with real feeling behind it. His fingers had found the keys like they'd never been away, but his emotions were rusty from being locked up for so long. He took a deep breath and let his hands drift into another piece. This one was different, sadder, more complex. It was something he'd written himself during those long nights at the hospital, sitting beside Rebecca's bed while she slept. The nurses had told him that patients could sometimes hear music even when they couldn't respond, so he would hum these melodies to her, promising that someday he'd play them properly on a real piano, but he'd never kept that promise. After Rebecca passed away, David had packed away everything musical in their house. The sheet music went into boxes in the attic. The small keyboard the girls used for practice got stored in the garage. Even their CD collection got put away because every song reminded him of something he'd lost. Now, sitting at this old upright piano in an empty community center, David finally understood what he'd been doing to himself. He hadn't just packed away the music, he'd packed away a part of his soul. The melody grew stronger under his fingers. What had started as a whisper became a conversation, then a story, then almost a prayer. The notes seemed to carry all the words he'd never been able to say out loud. The fear he felt every morning when he looked at his daughters and wondered if he was enough for them. The loneliness that hit him every evening after they went to bed. The guilt he carried for sometimes resenting how his life had turned out. But there was something else in the music too. Love pure and strong and unbreakable. Love for his girls who made him laugh every day with their silly questions and wild imaginations. Love for Rebecca, who would always be part of who he was. And maybe, just maybe, a tiny spark of hope that life could still hold beautiful surprises. What David didn't know was that his music was traveling far beyond the empty auditorium, 3 buildings away. night security guard Tom Wilson was doing his usual rounds when he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. At first, he thought someone had left a radio playing somewhere, but as he listened more carefully, he realized it was live piano music, and it was coming through the building's speaker system. Tom had worked security at various buildings for over 15 years, and he'd never heard anything like this during a night shift. The music was so beautiful it gave him goosebumps. He followed the sound through the hallways, trying to figure out where it was coming from. In the main administrative building, custodial supervisor Patricia was finishing up some paperwork when the music began flowing through the speakers in her office. She looked up from her desk, confused at first. The community center sometimes had evening events, but those usually ended by 8 o'clock. It was now past 10. Patricia had been working at the community center for 12 years and had heard plenty of performances during that time. School concerts, local theater productions, amateur talent shows, she'd heard them all. But this was different. This music had a depth to it that made her stop what she was doing and just listen. Meanwhile, in the youth center next door, program coordinator Lisa was staying late to prepare materials for tomorrow's after-school activities. She was cutting out paper shapes for a craft project when the piano music began drifting through the building. At first, she smiled, thinking one of the local musicians was having a late practice session. But as she continued listening, Lisa realized this wasn't just practice. This was someone pouring their heart out through music. The raw emotion in every note was impossible to ignore. She found herself setting down her scissors and walking toward the window that faced the main community center building. Back in the auditorium, David had moved into a piece that was entirely his own creation. He'd never written it down, never played it for anyone, never even hummed it out loud. It existed only in his mind and heart, born from those quiet moments after his daughters fell asleep, when he would sit at the kitchen table and imagine what he would say to Rebecca if he could see her one more time. The music became his voice when regular words weren't enough. It spoke of gratitude for the years they'd had together and sadness for all the years they'd never get. It told the story of two little girls who were growing up without their mother, but who carried her smile and her kindness in everything they did. It painted a picture of a man who was learning that being broken and being strong could happen at the same time. As David played, something unexpected began to happen. The tight feeling in his chest that he'd carried for 2 years started to loosen. Not disappear. He knew that kind of grief never completely goes away. But for the first time since Rebecca's death, the weight of his sadness felt manageable. His music grew bolder, more confident. The notes began to tell a different story, not just about loss, but about survival, about love that doesn't end when someone dies, about finding small moments of joy even in the middle of the hardest chapter of your life. Tom, the security guard, had made his way to the main community center and was now standing outside the auditorium doors. He could hear that the music was coming from inside, but he didn't want to interrupt what was clearly a private moment. Instead, he quietly radioed Patricia. "Hey, Patricia, are you hearing this music?" Patricia's voice crackled back through the radio. "I am." "Do you know who's playing?" "I'm outside the auditorium now. I think it might be David, the night custodian. His card is here." Patricia paused. She knew David as a quiet, reliable employee who always did excellent work. She'd noticed he seemed sad sometimes, but she'd never pried into his personal life. "Should we check on him?" Tom listened to the music flowing from behind the doors. "I don't think we should interrupt. This sounds like something he needs to do," and indeed David did need this. For the first time in 2 years, he was remembering who he used to be before grief changed everything. He was reconnecting with the part of himself that believed music could heal things that seemed permanently broken. The piano seemed to be responding to his touch like it had been waiting for him. Every note rang clear and true, filling the empty auditorium with sound that was somehow both heartbreaking and hopeful. David had no idea that his private moment of musical rediscovery was being witnessed by others. He had no idea that his music was touching people he'd never even met. All he knew was that for the first time in a very long time, he felt like himself again. Tom stood outside the auditorium doors, his radio still in his hand. He'd been a security guard for so many years that he thought he'd seen everything. Late-night maintenance workers, forgotten meetings that ran too long, even the occasional person who'd fallen asleep in the building after an event. But this was different. This was something beautiful happening in the middle of an ordinary night. He could hear David's music getting stronger, more confident. The melody had shifted from something sad and gentle to something that seemed to tell a whole story. Tom found himself leaning against the wall, not wanting to leave. In 15 years of working security, he'd never had a reason to just stand and listen to something this moving. His radio crackled again. "Tom, this is Patricia. I'm heading over there." "Copy that," Tom whispered back, not wanting his voice to interfere with the music. Patricia walked quickly through the connecting hallway between buildings. She'd tried to go back to her paperwork, but the music kept pulling her attention away from the budget reports on her desk. As the supervisor for all the custodial staff, she felt responsible for checking on David, but truthfully, her concern was mixed with curiosity. She'd worked with David for 3 years and had no idea he could play piano like this. When she reached the main building, she found Tom still standing guard outside the auditorium. He held up a finger to his lips and pointed at the doors. The music was even more beautiful up close, and Patricia felt her eyes start to water. She didn't consider herself particularly emotional, but something about this performance was touching a place in her heart she'd forgotten existed. "How long has he been playing?" she whispered. "About 20 minutes, Tom replied quietly. "It just keeps getting better." Through the doors they could hear David transitioning into another piece. This one was different again. It had a searching quality to it, like someone asking a question they weren't sure they wanted answered. The notes seemed to climb and fall, building toward something neither Tom nor Patricia could predict. Lisa had locked up the youth center and was walking to her car when she realized the music was even clearer outside the building. She stopped in the parking lot and looked up at the auditorium windows, which were glowing with the soft stage lights David used for cleaning. The music was so beautiful that she found herself walking back toward the building instead of leaving. When she reached the main entrance, she found it unlocked. Tom must have propped it open during his rounds. Lisa hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to intrude on what was clearly a private moment, but the music was calling to her in a way she couldn't ignore. She slipped inside and followed the sound down the hallway. As she got closer to the auditorium, she could see Tom and Patricia standing quietly outside the doors. They both turned when they heard her footsteps, and Patricia motioned for her to join them. "Is that David?" Lisa whispered. Patricia nodded. "We think so. His cleaning cart is here." The three of them stood together in the hallway, drawn by music that seemed to be coming from someone's deepest soul. Lisa had coordinated hundreds of performances at the community center over the years, but she'd never heard anything that moved her like this. Inside the auditorium, David was completely lost in his music. The piano bench where he sat might as well have been the center of the universe. Everything that had been weighing on his heart for the past 2 years was flowing out through his fingers. The bills on his kitchen table, the parent-teacher conferences where he felt out of his depth, the lonely evenings after the girls went to bed, all of it was being transformed into something beautiful. He began playing a melody that surprised even him. It started soft and uncertain, like a question being asked by a child. But as it developed, it became stronger and more sure of itself. The notes seemed to be telling the story of his daughters, Lucy with her serious expression when she was concentrating on homework, Amy with her wild imagination and her endless questions about everything. The music painted a picture of 2 little girls who were growing up to be strong and kind despite losing their mothers so young. It spoke of bedtime stories and scraped knees and the way they both still climbed into his bed during thunderstorms. It celebrated their laughter and their curiosity and the way they made him remember that life was still full of wonder, even when it felt impossibly difficult. Outside the doors, more people had begun to gather. Janet, the evening receptionist, from the senior center across the courtyard, had heard the music through her office window and come to investigate. Mike, who was working late in the maintenance shed, had followed the sound through the speakers in his workshop. None of them spoke. They just stood together in the hallway, united by something they couldn't quite explain. The music was creating a moment of connection between people who barely knew each other, reminding them all of something they'd forgotten in the rush of their daily lives. David's playing grew more intense. He'd moved into a piece that seemed to be wrestling with big questions about life and loss and hope. The melody would climb toward what sounded like joy, then fall back into something that felt like grief, then rise again with even more determination. Patricia found herself thinking about her own life, her elderly mother who lived alone, the phone calls she kept meaning to make but never found time for. Tom was remembering his daughter who lived across the country and how long it had been since they'd really talked. Lisa was thinking about all the families who came through the community center, and how many of them were probably carrying struggles she never saw. The music was doing something that rarely happened in their busy, separated lives. It was making them think about what really mattered. David began the most beautiful passage yet. His hands moved across the keys with a confidence he hadn't felt in years. This melody was about Rebecca, but not in a sad way. It was about the gift of having loved someone completely, and the way that love doesn't disappear when the person does. It becomes part of you, part of how you see the world, part of how you love other people. The notes seemed to dance together, telling a story of a marriage that had been cut short but had been real and deep and transformative. It spoke of morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, of holding hands during movies, of whispered conversations after the children were asleep. It painted a picture of ordinary moments that had been extraordinary because they were shared. With the right person. As the melody reached its peak, David felt something he hadn't experienced since before Rebecca got sick. He felt grateful. Not just sad about what he'd lost, but truly grateful for what he'd had. The music was helping him remember that love, real love, was always worth the pain of losing it. The small crowd in the hallway was completely still. Some of them had tears in their eyes. Others were just breathing quietly, afraid that any sound might break the spell that David's music was creating. Then, just as the beautiful melody about Rebecca was reaching its conclusion, something unexpected happened. David's phone, which he'd forgotten to put on silent, rang loudly from his pocket. The sudden harsh sound cut through the music like a knife. David's hands flew off the keys and the auditorium fell into shocked silence. His heart pounded as he realized what had just happened. He'd been so absorbed in playing that he'd completely forgotten where he was and what he was supposed to be doing outside the doors. The small group of listeners held their breath, wondering what would happen next. They could hear David moving around on the stage, probably panicking about being caught using the piano during work hours. The magic of the moment was broken, but something else was about to begin. Because now David knew he had an audience, and his audience knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. David's phone stopped ringing, but the damage was done. The spell was broken. He sat frozen at the piano bench, his heart hammering in his chest as reality came crashing back. What had he been thinking? He was supposed to be working, not sitting. Here playing piano like he owned the place. His hands shook as he reached into his pocket to check who had called. It was his neighbor, Mrs. Chun, probably calling to let him know everything was fine with the girls. She watched them sometimes when he had to work late, and she always called to give him updates. Under normal circumstances, he would have been grateful for her thoughtfulness. Right now, her timing couldn't have been worse. David quickly closed the piano cover and stood up, his mind racing. How long had he been playing? It felt like minutes, but when he looked at his watch, he realized it had been almost 45 minutes. 45 minutes of not doing his job. 45 minutes of using company property without permission. 45 minutes that could cost him the income his family desperately needed. He grabbed his cleaning supplies and started packing them up as quickly as possible. Maybe no one had heard him. Maybe he could finish his rounds and pretend this never happened. Maybe David? The voice came from behind him, soft and gentle. He turned around to see Patricia standing in the doorway of the auditorium. Her expression wasn't angry like he'd expected. Instead, she looked almost amazed. Uh, sorry, David said immediately, his words tumbling over each other. I know I shouldn't have been playing the piano. I was just finishing up the cleaning and I don't know what came over me. It won't happen again. Please don't fire me. My daughters... David, stop, Patricia said, walking slowly down the aisle toward the stage. You're not in trouble. David blinked at her, confused. I'm not? No, Patricia said, and now he could see that her eyes were red like she'd been crying. That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years. Before David could respond, Tom appeared in the doorway behind Patricia. Then Lisa, then Janet from the senior center. Then Mike from maintenance. One by one, they filed into the auditorium, all of them looking at David with expressions he couldn't quite read. David felt his face burning with embarrassment. Not only had people heard him playing, but apparently half the community center staff had gathered to listen. This was worse than he'd thought. I'm really sorry, he said again, climbing down from the stage. I know you all have work to do, and I was being disruptive. Disruptive? Tom interrupted, shaking his head. David, that wasn't disruptive. That was, Man, I don't even have words for what that was. Lisa stepped forward, and David could see that she was crying. Actually crying. David, I've been working here for 8 years. I've heard hundreds of performances on that stage. But what you just... Played that came from somewhere deep. That was real. David looked around at the small group of people staring at him, and he felt more exposed than he'd ever felt in his life. These were his coworkers, people he exchanged polite greetings with but didn't really know. He kept his personal life private, partly because he was naturally quiet and partly because his story was too sad to share with casual acquaintances. I didn't know anyone could hear me, he said quietly. The sound system was still on from the rehearsal earlier, Patricia explained. Your music was going through the speakers in all the buildings. David closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This was definitely going to get him fired. Look, I understand if you need to report this. I know I was supposed to be working, and instead I was... David, Patricia said firmly, I need you to listen to me. You're not in trouble. What I want to know is how long you've been able to play like that. The question caught David off guard. He'd been so focused on apologizing and trying to keep his job that he hadn't expected anyone to actually be interested in his music. I used to be a music teacher, he said hesitantly. Before I started working here, I taught elementary school for about 10 years. And you can play like that? Lisa asked, wiping her eyes. David, that wasn't just playing. That was like you were speaking a language the rest of us had forgotten existed. David didn't know what to say. He'd never thought of his music that way. To him, playing piano had always been as natural as breathing. It was just something he did, like some people could draw or cook or fix cars. Why did you stop teaching? Tom asked gently. This was the question David had been dreading. He looked down at his hands, which were still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of being discovered. My wife got sick, he said simply. Cancer. The medical bills were, they were more than a teacher's salary could handle. When she passed away 2 years ago, I needed a job with better pay and hours that would let me take care of my daughters. The group fell silent. David immediately regretted sharing so much. He didn't want their pity. He'd learned to hate the look people got when they heard his story, that mixture of sympathy and relief that it wasn't happening to them, but when he looked up, he didn't see pity in their faces. He saw understanding. Those pieces you were playing, Janet said softly, some of them sounded like they were about her, about missing someone. David nodded, not trusting his voice. And some of them sounded like they were about love, Lisa added. About the kind of love that doesn't end. When someone dies? The last piece, Patricia said, that felt like it was about hope. About believing that life can still be beautiful even after it breaks your heart. David stared at them in amazement. They had understood. Somehow, these people he barely knew had heard the story he was trying to tell through his music. They had listened not just with their ears, but with their hearts? I write music too, he admitted. I used to. Most of what you heard tonight, I wrote it myself during the hard times. You wrote that? Mike asked, speaking up for the first time. David, that music ... It helped me remember some things I'd forgotten about my own life. About people I've lost. It made me want to call my daughter, Tom added. We haven't talked in months because of some stupid argument. It made me think about my mother, Patricia said. About how I keep saying I'll visit her more often, but never actually do it. David felt overwhelmed. He'd spent 2 years thinking his music was just a private way to process his grief. He'd never imagined it could mean something to other people. David, Lisa said, and her voice had taken on an excited tone. I coordinate all the performances here at the community center. We have a big fundraiser coming up next month, and we're still looking for someone to be our featured performer. The piano pieces you played tonight. Would you consider performing them for a real audience? David's first instinct was to say no. The idea of performing in public again, of being vulnerable. In front of strangers, the way he'd just been vulnerable in front of his coworkers, terrified him. I don't think I'm ready for that, he said. You don't have to decide tonight, Patricia said kindly. But David, what you have ... it's a gift, and gifts like that are meant to be shared. As the small group began to disperse, each of them stopping. To thank David for the unexpected concert, he realized something had fundamentally changed. Not just in how his coworkers saw him, but in how he saw himself. For 2 years, he'd thought of himself as just a man trying to survive. Tonight, he remembered that he was also a musician. And maybe, just maybe, that part of him was ready to come back to life. David couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of what had happened at the community center. The way Patricia's eyes had filled with tears. The way Tom had talked about calling his daughter. The way Lisa had looked at him when she asked him to perform at the fundraiser. He rolled over and looked at the clock. 3 a.m. In a few hours, Lucy and Amy would be awake, and he'd need to get them ready for school. He'd need to make breakfast and pack lunches and help Amy find her favorite stuffed animal that she always lost somewhere between bedtime and morning. Normal dad things. Things that kept him grounded in reality felt different now. For 2 years, his reality had been simple. Work, take care of the girls, pay the bills, survive each day. Music had been something from his past, something he'd put away like childhood toys that no longer fit his life. Now Lisa's question kept echoing in his head. Would he consider performing at the fundraiser? The idea made his stomach twist with anxiety. Playing alone in an empty auditorium was one thing. Playing in front of hundreds of people who had paid money to hear good music was something else entirely. The next evening at work, David found himself walking more slowly toward the auditorium. He'd spent the whole day trying to act normal around Lucy and Amy, helping them with homework and making dinner as usual. But his mind kept drifting back to the piano. When he reached the auditorium doors, he hesitated. Last night had been an accident, a moment of weakness when grief and loneliness had overwhelmed his common sense. Tonight, if he played, it would be a choice. He pushed the doors open and wheeled his cart inside. The piano sat there exactly as he'd left it, the bench pushed in neatly, the key cover closed. It looked innocent enough, just an old instrument waiting patiently for someone to bring it to life. David started his cleaning routine, but his movements felt mechanical. He swept the aisles without really seeing them, wiped down the armrests, without thinking about what he was doing. His mind was somewhere else entirely. When he finally made it to the stage, he found himself moving more slowly than usual. He mopped around the piano carefully, taking extra time to clean areas that were already spotless. He was avoiding the inevitable decision, to play or not to play. The choice was made for him when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside. David froze, his mop halfway across the stage floor. Someone was coming. The auditorium doors opened, and Patricia walked in. She was carrying a cup of coffee and had that tired look that comes from working too many late hours. Hi, David, she said, settling into a seat in the front row. Don't mind me. I was just hoping I might hear some music tonight. David stared at her. You want me to play? Only if you want to, Patricia said, taking a sip of her coffee. But after last night, Well, let's just say I haven't been able to get those melodies out of my head all day. David looked at the piano, then back at Patricia. Having an audience, even an audience of one, changed everything. Last night had been private, personal. This felt like a performance, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. I don't know, he said honestly. What if I mess up? What if it's not as good as last night? Patricia smiled. David, last night you played from your heart. That's not something you can mess up. The technical stuff, that's just technique. What made your music special was the feeling behind it. David set down his mop and walked over to the piano bench. His hands were shaking slightly as he lifted the key cover. The black and white keys looked back at him, waiting. What should I play? He asked. Whatever feels right, Patricia said. Whatever wants to come out. David placed his fingers on the keys and closed his eyes. He tried to find that same emotional space he'd been in the night before, that place where his heart could speak through his hands. But it was harder with someone watching. He felt self-conscious, like he was trying too hard. The first few notes came out tentative and uncertain. David winced at how they sounded. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of. Last night had been a fluke, a moment of emotional intensity that couldn't be repeated on command. Stop thinking so much, Patricia said gently from her seat. You're trying to recreate last night, but tonight is different. What does tonight feel like? David paused, his hands resting on the keys. What did tonight feel like? It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, afraid to jump, but knowing that staying safe wasn't really living. It felt like being offered a gift and not knowing if he deserved to accept it. He began again, this time letting the uncertainty become part of the music. The melody that emerged was hesitant at first, full of questions and doubt. But as he played, the music began to find its own path. It spoke of fear and hope wrestling with each other. It painted a picture of a man who had forgotten how to dream, but was starting to remember. Patricia listened without moving, her coffee growing cold in her hands. She could hear David's internal struggle in every note, the battle between the part of him that wanted to hide and the part that wanted to soar. The music grew stronger as David stopped fighting it. This piece was different from anything he'd played the night before. It was about the moment when someone decides to take a chance, even when they're terrified of failing. It was about choosing to be vulnerable because the alternative was staying numb forever. As the melody reached its peak, David felt something shift inside his chest. The fear was still there, but it was balanced now by something else. Excitement. For the first time in 2 years, he was excited about the possibility of sharing his music with people. When the last notes faded away, Patricia sat in silence for a long moment. Then she started clapping, slow and steady, her eyes bright with tears. That, she said, was what tonight feels like. That was beautiful, David. David felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It had been beautiful. Different from last night, but beautiful in its own way. The fundraiser, he said suddenly. When is it? 3 weeks from Saturday, Patricia replied. But David, you don't have to decide. I want to do it, David said, the words coming out before he could stop them. I mean, I'm terrified. But I want to try. Patricia's face lit up. Really? Are you sure? David looked down at his hands, still resting on the piano keys. These hands that changed diapers and made peanut butter sandwiches and mopped floors. These hands that had held Rebecca's hand during her final days. These hands that were somehow capable of creating beauty even in the middle of an ordinary life. Sure, he said. My daughters, they've never heard me play. Not really. Maybe it's time they knew that their dad isn't just someone who cleans buildings. Maybe it's time they knew he's someone who makes music too. Patricia wiped her eyes. They're going to be so proud of you. I hope so, David said. I hope I don't disappoint them. David, Patricia said firmly, what you just played, that couldn't disappoint anyone. That was real. That was honest. That was exactly what people need to hear. As David packed up his cleaning supplies, he felt lighter than he had in months. The decision was made. In 3 weeks he would walk onto this stage not as a janitor who happened to play piano, but as a musician who happened to clean buildings to pay the bills The difference mattered more than he'd expected. Word spread faster than David had expected. By the end of the week, it seemed like everyone at the community center knew about the janitor who could play piano like an angel. People he'd worked alongside for 3 years suddenly looked at him differently. Some smiled and nodded when they passed him in the hallways. Others stopped to chat, asking about his music or sharing stories about songs that had meant something to them. David wasn't used to being the center of attention, and he found the whole thing both exciting and terrifying. For so long he'd been invisible, just another worker doing his job, going home to his quiet life with his daughters. Now people were talking about him, and that felt strange. The strangest conversation happened on Thursday evening when he was emptying trash cans. In the senior center, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who came to the building every day for activities, approached him with tears in her eyes. "Young man," she said, her voice shaky with emotion, "I heard you playing piano the other night." The sound carried all the way to our building. David stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. Mrs. Henderson was probably in her 80s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I hope it wasn't too loud," David said. "I didn't realize anyone could hear." "Oh, no, dear," Mrs. Henderson interrupted, reaching out to touch his arm. "It was beautiful. It reminded me of my late husband. He used to play piano for me when we were young. Your music? It brought back memories I thought I'd lost." She paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "I haven't felt that close to him in years. Thank you for that gift." David felt his throat tighten. He'd never thought about his music affecting people he didn't even know, people in other buildings who just happened to hear the sound drifting through their windows. "Mrs. Henderson," he said gently, "would you like to come to the fundraiser? I'm going to perform there, and I'd love to have you in the audience." Her face lit up like a child's on Christmas morning. "Really? You'd want an old lady like me there?" "I'd be honored," David said, and he meant it. Word about David's upcoming performance had also reached some unexpected places. Lisa had mentioned it to her friend who worked at the local newspaper, and suddenly David found himself fielding a phone call from a reporter who wanted to write a story about the janitor-turned-performer. "I don't think that's necessary," David told the reporter politely. "It's just a community fundraiser." But the reporter was persistent. "Mr. Rodriguez, people love stories about hidden talent being discovered. This could inspire others who have given up on their dreams." David thought about that conversation for days. Had he given up on his dreams, or had life just forced him to put them aside for a while? There was a difference, and for the first time in 2 years, he was starting to understand what it was. The real test came the following weekend when he decided it was time to tell Lucy and Amy about his upcoming performance. They were eating breakfast, pancakes that were slightly burned because David had been distracted thinking about music when he cleared his throat nervously. "Girls, I have something to tell you," he said. Setting down his coffee cup, Lucy looked up from her plate, syrup dripping from her fork. "Are we in trouble?" "No, nothing like that," David said, laughing despite his nervousness. "I wanted you to know that I'm going to perform at a concert in a couple of weeks." Amy's eyes went wide. "A concert? Like on TV?" "Not on TV, but on a real stage at the community center where I work." "What are you going to perform?" Lucy asked, ever practical like her mother had been. David took a deep breath. "Piano music." "I'm going to play piano." The girls stared at him in silence for a moment. Then Amy dropped her fork with a clatter. "You can play piano?" she asked, her voice full of amazement. Double quotes. "Yes, sweetheart. I used to play before everything changed." "Can you play right now?" Lucy asked, suddenly excited. David looked around their small apartment. They didn't have a piano anymore. He'd sold it to help pay the medical bills. "We don't have a piano here, remember?" "Why not?" Amy asked, her lower lip starting to tremble the way it did when she was upset. This was the conversation David had been dreading. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that sometimes life forces you to sell the things you love most? "Well," he said carefully, "when Mom was sick, we needed money for the doctors. So I sold our piano to help pay for her medicine." Lucy, who was old enough to understand more than her younger sister, nodded slowly. That's why you stopped being a music teacher too, isn't it? Yes, David said simply. I had to find a job that paid more money so I could take care of you girls. Amy's eyes filled with tears. But I wanted to learn piano like Mom said I could. David's heart broke a little. Rebecca had promised both girls that they would learn piano when they got older. It was one of many promises that her death had made impossible to keep. Maybe, David said slowly, if the concert goes well, we can think about getting a piano again someday. Really? Both girls asked at the same time. Really, David said, though he had no idea how he would manage it financially. That evening, David called Mrs. Chun, their neighbor, to ask if she could watch the girls for a few hours. He had an idea, and he needed to see if it would work. He drove to the music store across town, the same place where he bought his first piano 20 years ago. The owner, Mr. Kim, recognized him immediately. David, I haven't seen you in years. How are you doing? I'm okay, David said. Listen, I have a strange request. I'm performing at a concert in 2 weeks and I need to practice, but I don't have a piano at home anymore. Mr. Kim's expression grew serious. I heard about Rebecca. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you, David said. I was wondering. Do you still rent practice time on your pianos? Of course, Mr. Kim said. But David, for you, no charge. You've been through enough. David felt his eyes water. That's very kind, but I can pay. Nonsense, Mr. Kim interrupted. Music is meant to be shared. Besides, I'd love to hear what you've been working on. For the next 2 weeks, David spent his free time at the music store, practicing on a beautiful grand piano in the back room. His fingers remembered songs he thought he'd forgotten. His heart rediscovered melodies he'd buried under years of grief and worry. Mr. Kim would sometimes listen from the front of the store, and other customers would pause their shopping to hear the music coming from the practice room. David was slowly getting used to having an audience again. The strangest thing was how natural it felt. After the first few sessions, sitting at the piano didn't feel like returning to something he'd lost. It felt like coming home to something that had been waiting patiently for him to be ready. One evening, as David was finishing his practice, Mr. Kim approached him with a thoughtful expression. David, he said, I have an old upright piano in my warehouse. It needs some work, but it's a good instrument. If you're interested, we could work out a payment plan. Very reasonable terms? David looked at the man who had just given him 2 weeks of free practice time and was now offering to help him buy a piano for his daughters. Why? David asked. Why are you being so kind to me? Mr. Kim smiled. Because music makes the world a better place. And because some people are meant to make music, no matter what life throws at them. You're one of those people, David. As David drove home that night, he realized something important had happened. For 2 years, he'd thought of himself as someone who used to make music. Now he was beginning to understand that he was someone who would always make music. No matter what job he had to do to support his family, the concert was only a week away. And for the first time since agreeing to perform, David felt truly ready. The day of the fundraiser arrived with an unexpected spring rain that drummed against David's apartment windows. He woke up at 5 in the morning, 2 hours before his alarm, with his heart already racing. Tonight was the night. After 3 weeks of practice and preparation, he would finally step onto that stage not as a janitor, but as a musician. Lucy and Amy were still asleep in their shared bedroom, their breathing soft and peaceful. David stood in their doorway for a moment, watching them. In a few hours, they would see a side of their father they'd never known existed. He hoped they would be proud. He hoped he wouldn't disappoint them. The morning passed in a blur of nervous energy. David made breakfast, but could barely eat anything. Himself, he helped the girls get ready for their Saturday activities. Lucy had soccer practice, and Amy had a play date at a friend's house. Mrs. Chun would pick them up later and bring them to the community center for the evening performance. Are you nervous, Daddy? Amy asked as she tied her sneakers. A little bit, David admitted, but it's a good kind of nervous. Like when you're excited and scared at the same time. Like when I got on the big roller coaster, Amy asked. Exactly. Like that? David said, smiling despite his anxiety. Lucy looked up from packing her soccer ball. Will there be lots of people there tonight? I think so, David said. The community center holds about 300 people, and Lisa said they've sold almost all the tickets. The truth was, David tried not to think about the size of the audience. 300 people was more than he'd ever performed for, even back when he was actively pursuing music. The biggest crowd he'd ever faced was maybe 50 people at a local coffee shop open mic night. Dropping the girls off at their activities, David found himself with several hours to kill before the performance. He drove to the music store, where Mr. Kim let him practice one final time on the grand piano. How are you feeling? Mr. Kim asked as David sat down at the bench. Terrified, David said honestly. What if I forget the music? What if my hands shake too much to play? What if people realize I'm just a janitor pretending to be a musician? Mr. Kim pulled up a chair beside the piano. David, let me tell you something. I've been selling pianos for 30 years. I've heard thousands of people play. Some of them had fancy degrees and perfect technique. But you know what made the difference between the musicians people forgot and the ones they remembered? David shook his head. Heart, Mr. Kim said simply. The ones people remembered played with their whole heart. And you, my friend, have more heart in your music than anyone I've ever heard. David felt some of his anxiety ease. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play the pieces he'd chosen for tonight. First, the Chopin nocturne that had started everything, then his original composition about Rebecca. Finally, the new piece he'd written just for this performance, a song about hope and second chances that he'd titled After the Rain. As he played, David felt the music calming his nerves. This was why he was doing this. Not for the applause or the recognition, but because music was how he spoke his deepest truths. Tonight, 300 people would hear his story told through melodies and harmonies. That was both terrifying and wonderful. When David arrived at the community center that evening, he was amazed by what he saw. The parking lot was nearly full, and people were streaming toward the main entrance dressed in their best clothes. Lisa had transformed the lobby with flowers and elegant banners advertising the fundraiser. David, there you are. Patricia appeared at his elbow, looking more excited than he'd ever seen her. Are you ready for this? As ready as I'll ever be, David said, though his voice came out slightly hoarse. Come on, let me show you the backstage area, Patricia said, leading him toward a side entrance. Backstage was a flurry of activity. There were other performers getting ready, a children's choir from the local elementary school, a jazz trio from the high school, and a dance group from the senior center. David felt out of place among these organized groups with their matching outfits and professional equipment. You're the pianist, right? Asked a teenage girl from the jazz trio. Everyone's talking about you. They say you're amazing. David felt his face flush. I'm just playing a few songs. Don't be modest, said the choir director, a woman David recognized from the community center. Lisa played us a recording from your practice sessions. You're the real deal. Recording? David looked around for Lisa, who appeared as if summoned. Don't be mad, Lisa said quickly, seeing his expression. I recorded a few minutes on my phone during one of your practice sessions, just so the other performers would know what to expect. The sound quality isn't great, but people have been asking to hear it all week, Patricia added. David, you have fans already? The idea of having fans was so foreign to David that he almost laughed. 3 weeks ago, he was invisible. Tonight, people had bought tickets hoping to hear him play as the evening progressed. David watched the other acts from the wings. The children's choir was adorable, singing songs about friendship and dreams. The dance group from the senior center brought energy and joy that had the whole audience clapping along. The high school jazz trio was technically impressive, their young faces serious with concentration. Then it was David's turn. Lisa walked onto the stage to introduce him, and David's heart started pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Our next performer, Lisa said into the microphone, represents something special about our community. David has worked here at the community center for 3 years, and until recently none of us knew that we had a truly gifted musician walking among us every day. From behind the curtain, David could see the audience. The auditorium was packed. In the front row, he spotted Lucy and Amy sitting with Mrs. Chun, their eyes wide with excitement. A few rows back, he saw Mrs. Henderson, who had dressed up in her finest dress for the occasion. Tom, the security guard, was there with his wife. Mike from maintenance had brought his whole family. David's story reminds us that talent and beauty exist everywhere, Lisa continued, sometimes in the most unexpected places. His music speaks to the universal experiences of love, loss, hope, and healing. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Rodriguez. The applause was warm and encouraging. As David walked onto the stage, the spotlight was brighter than he'd expected, and for a moment he couldn't see past the first few rows. His hands were shaking as he sat down at the piano bench. He looked out at the audience and found Lucy and Amy's faces. They were both beaming with pride, and Amy was bouncing slightly in her seat with excitement. Seeing their joy gave David the courage he needed. He placed his hands on the keys and took a deep breath. "This first piece," he said into the small microphone attached to the piano, "is for my wife Rebecca, who always believed that music could heal anything." As David began the opening notes of the Chopin Nocturne, the auditorium fell completely silent. But this wasn't the uncomfortable silence of people waiting to be impressed. This was the hushed reverence that comes when people recognize they're about to witness something truly special. David lost himself in the music, just as he had that first night 3 weeks ago. The difference was that now he wasn't alone with his grief and memories. He was sharing them with a room full of people who were ready to listen with their hearts. The first notes of the Chopin Nocturne floated through the auditorium like gentle rain. David's hands had stopped shaking the moment they touched the keys, as if the piano itself was giving him strength. The melody was familiar to everyone in the audience. It was the kind of classical piece people had heard in movies or commercials, but David's interpretation was deeply personal. He played it the way Rebecca had loved to hear it, with extra emphasis on the tender passages that had always made her smile. As the music swelled and softened, David could almost feel her presence beside him, encouraging him the way she always had. In the front row, Lucy leaned forward in her seat, her mouth slightly open in amazement. She had never imagined that her father, the man who made her breakfast every morning and helped with homework every night, could create something so beautiful. Amy was completely still, which was unusual for a 6-year-old, her eyes fixed on her father's hands as they danced across the keys. Mrs. Henderson, sitting in her carefully chosen seat 4 rows back, had tears streaming down her cheeks. The music was transporting her back 50 years to when her husband would play this same piece on their old piano in their first apartment. She could almost smell the coffee they used to share on Sunday mornings while he played as the nocturne came to its gentle conclusion. The applause was immediate and heartfelt. But David barely heard it. He was already transitioning into his second piece, the original composition he had written for Rebecca during her final days. "This next song," David said softly into the microphone, "is something I wrote for my wife when she was very sick. I never played it for anyone while she was alive, but I think she would have wanted people to hear it." The melody that emerged was unlike anything the audience had ever heard. It started with simple, lonely notes that spoke of sitting by a hospital bed in the middle of the night. But as the piece developed, other voices joined in: hope fighting with despair, love refusing to give up even when faced with the impossible. The music told the story of a marriage without using any words. It painted pictures of quiet moments shared between two people who knew their time together was running out. It captured the beauty of ordinary love, morning coffee, shared laughter, hands held in the dark. Tom, the security guard, found himself thinking about his own wife, sitting beside him in the auditorium. When was the last time he'd told her he loved her? When was the last time they'd really talked, not just about schedules and bills, but about the things that mattered? Throughout the audience, people were having similar thoughts. The music was acting like a mirror reflecting back their own experiences of love and loss. Some were remembering people they'd lost. Others were thinking about people they still had but maybe didn't appreciate enough. Patricia, sitting with the other community center staff, watched David with a mixture of pride and amazement. 3 weeks ago, she had thought she knew him. Quiet, reliable, hardworking. Now she realized she had only seen one small part of who he really was. The music revealed depths in David that his everyday life had hidden. As the composition about Rebecca reached its climax, David's playing became more intense. His whole body swayed with the music, and his face showed every emotion the melody contained. This wasn't just a performance, it was a man's heart being laid bare for everyone to see. The piece ended with a single, sustained note that seemed to hang in the air forever before finally fading to silence. The auditorium was completely quiet. For several seconds, as if the audience needed time to process what they had just experienced, then the applause began. It started slowly, with just a few people clapping, but quickly built into something thunderous. People were standing up, wiping their eyes, some of them openly crying. Lucy and Amy were clapping so enthusiastically that Mrs. Chun had to remind. Then they were in a theater, not at a baseball game, but David wasn't finished. He had one more piece to play, the song he had written specifically for this performance. After the Rain, the piece about hope and second chances. This last song, David said, his own voice thick with emotion, is about what happens after the storm passes. It's about learning that life can still be beautiful, even after it breaks your heart. The opening notes were gentle but confident, like sunlight breaking through clouds. The melody spoke of healing, of small steps forward, of discovering that joy could coexist with grief. It painted a picture of a father teaching his daughters to ride bikes, of bedtime stories and scraped knees and the ordinary miracles that make up a life. As David played, he found himself thinking not just about the past, but about the future. For the first time in 2 years, he could imagine possibilities beyond just surviving each day. Maybe he could teach music again. Maybe he could perform more often. Maybe he could show his daughters that it was possible to follow your dreams, even when life knocked you down. The music grew stronger and more hopeful. It told the story of a community coming together, of unexpected kindness from strangers, of discovering that you're not as alone as you thought. It celebrated the people who had helped David find his way back to music, Patricia, who encouraged him, Mr. Kim, who gave him a place to practice, Lisa, who believed in his talent enough to put him on this stage. In the audience, people were experiencing something rare in their busy lives, a moment of pure connection. The music was creating a shared experience that went beyond words. Strangers were smiling at each other through their tears. Families were holding hands a little tighter. As After the Rain built to its joyful conclusion, David felt something he hadn't experienced since before Rebecca got sick. He felt complete. Not because the sadness was gone, it would always be part of him, but because he had found a way to transform that sadness into something beautiful that could touch other people's lives. The final notes rang out clear and strong, filled with hope and possibility. When David lifted his hands from the keys, the silence lasted only a heartbeat before the entire auditorium erupted. People weren't just clapping anymore, they were cheering, shouting, jumping to their feet. Lucy and Amy were bouncing up and down, their faces glowing with pride. "That's our daddy," Amy shouted, loud enough to be heard over the applause. David stood up from the piano bench and looked out at the sea of faces. 300 people, all of them moved by his music, all of them sharing this moment with him. He thought about that night 3 weeks ago, when he had sat at this same piano. Alone and heartbroken, never imagining that anyone would hear him play, Lisa appeared on stage, with tears in her eyes and a huge smile on her face. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said into the microphone, "I think we can all agree that was something truly special." The applause continued for what felt like forever. David took several bows, still hardly believing what was happening. When he finally walked off the stage, he was surrounded by people wanting to talk to him, to thank him, to share their own stories. But the most important moment came when Lucy and Amy reached him. They threw their arms around his waist, and Amy looked up at him with shining eyes. "Daddy," she said, "you're not just a daddy. You're magic." 6 months later, David was teaching piano lessons at the community center 3 evenings a week. The old upright piano from Mr. Kim's warehouse now sat in their living room, slightly out of tune but perfect for Lucy and Amy's beginner lessons. And every few months, David performed another concert, always playing with the same honesty and heart that had moved 300 people on that rainy Saturday night. He had learned that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most broken places, and that sharing your gifts with others doesn't just change their lives, it transforms your own.